Next up, we have a gentleman named Mark Devlin, and he has a talk called No More Heroes. So for mic'd up, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Mark Devlin.
Well, thanks very much. Morning, folks. Thanks for turning out. It seems I'm one of two token English accents at this conference, the other one being David Icke. And I could quite happily do a 10-hour all-dayer like he does with this material, but I've only got half an hour, so it's the condensed version of it today. By way of some very brief background, I've been a radio and club DJ for the past nearly 30 years now. And I was fortunate enough to travel all over the world and do gigs in many different countries. But my life changed forever in 2010 when I came to some deep comprehensions of what's really going on in this world, who's really running every aspect of our daily lives, which is very different to many of the organizations and the individuals that we think are running things. And this sent me down the rabbit hole of exploring the subject areas of culture creation, social engineering, mass mind control, and lifetime actors. Going to be looking at many of these elements in the talk today. Being that this is a conference for anarchists and free thinkers, and we're all people that don't like government, right? We don't like being controlled, we don't like being coerced against our will. Well, there's an aspect of that which goes on that very much flies under the radar and which people very rarely think about. And that is what is achieved by way of culture and entertainment. And so I've titled this talk, No More Heroes. And there was a beautiful synchronicity last night when I was explaining to somebody in the Palladium nightclub. There's Jason there. And at the very moment I started talking about this presentation, the song No More Heroes by the Stranglers came on the PA system in the club. So I take that as a confirmation that I'm on the right track. Let's start with a quote from a dude that knew what he was talking about, Edward Bernays, the double nephew of Sigmund Freud, the famous psychoanalyst, and a big-time establishment insider, known as the father of public relations, propaganda. He put out a book in 1928 titled Propaganda, getting on for 100 years ago. And the dynamic hasn't really changed from that day to this. So he stated in that book, we are governed, our minds are moulded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind, who harness old social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world. It was going on then, it's going on today. The names have changed, but the dynamic is exactly the same. Another dude that knew what he was talking about would be Aldous Huxley, eugenicist, co-architect of the CIA's MK-Ultra program, and another big-time elite insider. One of his statements was, sooner or later you have to bring in an element of persuasion, an element of getting people to consent to what is happening to them. If you can get people to consent to the state of affairs, you have a much more easily controllable society than you would if you were relying wholly on clubs and firing squads and concentration camps. There was a former KGB agent by the name of Yuri Bezmenov, who a few years ago became something of a whistleblower and an insider, spilling the beans on many of the tactics that were used during the Cold War years by the Soviet political system. And in one of his documents here, which he presented, it's different stages of Soviet ideological subversion. If you look at number 4 on the list, it states culture, false heroes and role models. And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about people who are in the public eye, people that we've all heard of, people who are household names that we revere and we worship and we place on pedestals. And we're all guilty of this. We've all had personal heroes, right? Whether it's an actor or a musician, it might be a consciousness guru, it might be somebody in the truth and freedom movement, it might be a politician. In my case, it was other DJs. For many years, I looked up to certain high-profile DJs and I used to get inspired by them until I knew better. But this is how it gets done. And we're going to look at some examples here from the music industry of lifetime actors and false heroes and role models that are served up to us and presented to us, it's not us that choose them. Have you ever noticed that? These people are given to us and we don't really get any say in the matter. We can choose whether we embrace these people, and sometimes they're very seductive and they make us want to go with what they're espousing, but we never really know where they come from. There was a great piece of work put out by the late author and researcher Dave McGowan a few years ago called Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. Sadly, McGowan died in late 2015, but he left behind this amazing piece of work. And it focused on the Laurel Canyon district of Los Angeles. And it was the years of the 60s counterculture, mid to late 1960s, all these musicians who all of a sudden started congregating in this one particular community of LA, which previously had no kind of musical heritage whatsoever, but all of a sudden you had all these big household name artists appearing in this one small neighborhood. One of the classic stories from that book is that of Jim Morrison of The Doors. It's an often told story, but it bears repeating because it helps to illustrate the point. So we think of Jim Morrison as this larger-than-life iconic rock god who was anti-war, anti-establishment, anti-the man, and all of this. But it turns out that he was an actor, literally, all along. There's a video you can get on YouTube dating back to early 1964 where he took part in a commercial for the University of Florida, looking very clean-cut and collegiate, and you can see this ad for yourself on YouTube. That was his first public role, very much at odds with his rock god image of a few years later. Now here's a very important picture of Jim Morrison with his father, who was this guy, Admiral George Stephen Morrison. He was a US naval commander, and he just happened to be the guy that was in charge of the fleet of ships involved in the Gulf of Tonkin false flag incident, which springboarded America into the Vietnam War. So how do you reconcile the fact that you've got one guy who is supposed to be this anti-war, anti-establishment icon, the poster child for an entire troubled generation, and his dad is involved in the event that embroils America in this bloody and horrific war that lasts for 10 years or more? Well, the only way you can reconcile these things is if you accept that Jim Morrison was a lifetime actor and his role was very different to the one which was presented to us, the public relations version of things, the Wikipedia version of things. This is what we're entrained to believe and think of in terms of these individuals, but when you get into some of their backgrounds and their affiliations, it tells a rather different story. And this style of research is now going on big time. There's many people delving into all this stuff. Blame it on the bloodlines. Well, so much of what gets done comes down to genealogy, ancestry, family connections, where these people come from. Here's a very telling and potent quote from Madonna. It speaks to this public relations version of things that we're all entrained to believe in, which is artists get to the top, whether it's Elvis Presley or the Beatles or Madonna, through just working really hard, keeping their fingers crossed for good luck, learning their trade, doing a bit of hustling, doing a bit of networking. If you do all that, you can reach the lofty heights that the likes of Madonna do, goes the public version of things. So she said here in her Virgin Tour 1985 video, I went to New York, wanted to be a big star, didn't know anyone, wanted to sing, wanted to dance. I wanted to be famous. I wanted everybody to love me. I wanted to be a star. I worked really hard, and my dream came true. Sounds like a fairy tale, right? It's because it is. A few years ago, it emerged in the mainstream press that Madonna just happens to be a cousin of Ellen DeGeneres, or whatever her name is. Not entirely sure what she's famous for, but I know she's in the public eye. But it goes further than that. It also turns out that Madonna and Lady Gaga are distant cousins. So when you look at the family trees, it's cousins 8 or 9 times removed, this kind of thing, but you can trace the ancestry back, and they're genealogically linked. They come from these important bloodlines either way. So who would have believed this? Isn't it incredible? Against all the odds, these two very popular music stars just happen to be related. But it gets even more ridiculous than that. Here's another family tree for you to get your head around. It revolves around village idiot Bush in the middle there, and all the family links that he has. So we've got Madonna down here, but one way or another, by way of cousins and related by marriage and all of this, we find bloodline links to Celine Dion, Marilyn Monroe, Brad Pitt, Dick Cheney, Barack Obama. So much for political opponents, right, when they come from the same friggin' families. Then you've got Hugh Hefner, you've got John Kerry, Diana, Princess of Wales. It's ridiculous. Pocahontas is in there as well. Don't ask me how. Didn't even know she was a historical figure, but apparently she was. And yet, we're supposed to think that these people got to the top through pure random chance. Could have been anyone, right? And it just happened to be them. Well, no, because these people are selected for us. Here's some more. Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, who are related to each other, are also related to Brad and Angelina. Who would have thought it? Well, when you get into this style of work, there's very few surprises left, let me tell you. This is a group from the late 1960s psychedelic period by the name of Coven. They had a delightful album out in the late 60s called Witchcraft Destroys Minds and Reaps Souls. So one to play for the kids at the weekend, you know. And the front woman of this group was this person, Esther Dawson, known as Jinx Dawson. The group were heavily into Satanism. There's lots of dark occult imagery in their artwork. And on that particular album, it's depicting a black mass taking place. And you've got all these people standing around doing the devil horns in the air. So delightful stuff. Anyway, she did an interview a while back where she talked about her family background, and it's all right there in plain sight in her own words. She talks about having been from the Mayflower Society, a direct descendant of one of the signatories to the Mayflower Compact. Members of my family were also active in 33rd degree Scottish Rite Freemasonry. She says her grandfather was a former governor of Indiana and a high priest of the Royal Archmasons. Her great-grandfather was in the private circle of US President Teddy Roosevelt, and were listed in the book The First Families of America. So she says, in her own words, I am steeped in American Illuminati. The group Killing Joke are often held up to be a breath of fresh air in the music industry because they seemingly put out music that is anti-establishment and is going against the grain. But when we look into the background of the frontman Jazz Coleman, in his own words, again, he says that his great-great-great-grandfather led the insurrection against the British in 1857 and is revered in Mother India as one of the great nationalists. And there's B.N. Pandey, who wrote The Breakup of British India and was very close to Gandhi. So again, what are the chances of these kinds of establishment links from some random pop star that just worked a few gigs and worked really hard to get where he was, versus these individuals being deliberately placed into the culture so they can have an influencing effect on the general mindset by way of the families that they come from, the roles that are given to them. Here's another one which surprises many people, Dave Grohl of the Foo Fighters and formerly Nirvana. So his father, James Harper Grohl, worked in politics as an assistant to Robert A. Taft Jr. His father was William Howard Taft, 27th President of the United States, and his father was Alfonso Taft, a founder of the Skull and Bones occult secret society operating out of Yale University. So we've got it all there. Never get tired of telling this story. There's one particular family which had its finger in the pie of the punk and new wave movement in the late 1970s going into the early 80s, and that is the Copeland family, the patriarch of which was a guy by the name of Miles Copeland Sr. And he was a big-time career CIA guy, worked all around the world in different positions. He had 3 sons, and he put them all to use in the music industry. So we have on the left here, Ian Copeland. You're probably going to recognize the drummer with the group The Police, Stuart Copeland, in the middle, and then Miles Copeland Jr. here on the right. Now these 3 had various businesses which went by initials when you broke down the names. So they had one sort of holding company which was Copeland International Artists, work out the initials. They also had International Records Syndicate. They had another company called Frontier Booking International. And of course, finally, there was The Police with Sting, as in Sting Operation. So it's not as if they don't take the piss every now and again and place the truth right there in plain sight. knowing that the vast majority of people are never going to see it. But that's changing. Another group, Talking Heads, and there was a splinter project called the Tom Tom Club. Looking at one of the key members of those two groups, Tina Weymouth, her brother Yan, a Harvard graduate, turns out to have been chief of design for the Chinese-American architect on the Grand Louvre project in Paris, involving the placement of the iconic glass pyramid. Then when you go to her father, Ralph Weymouth, well, he was another Vice Admiral of the US Navy and Master of the Freemason Grand Lodge of Maine, wouldn't you know? So more establishment links coming out of the woodwork here. So as George Carlin so astutely observed, it's a big club and you ain't in it, and why would you want to be? It's your biggest blessing, trust me. Culture creation and lifetime actors. So it's not just individuals that are served up to us who are doing the bidding of the control system that they represent. This also applies to fads, trends, and movements. Anything which changes culture, anything which changes societal attitudes and value systems and beliefs. If something sweeps up vast numbers of people in its wake, you can be sure that it's the product of one of these organizations which specialize in making these things happen. So we're talking military intelligence operations here, coming out of the CIA, MI6 in Britain, the likes of the Tavistock Institute, the likes of the Frankfurt School, and all these different social engineering think tanks. A masterclass in all this comes from, again, the counterculture period of the 1960s, where you had this public hero, the very epitome of a consciousness guru, Dr. Timothy Leary, who was this Harvard professor who apparently dropped out and started endorsing psychedelics and started encouraging the youth of the time to drop out of society in the same way and reject traditional values and all of this. Well, unfortunately, it turns out that Dr. Timothy Leary was an asset of the CIA. In several interviews that he gave in his own words, he talked in his later years of the entire counterculture project and all the insertion of the LSD that was everywhere at that time having been a product of the CIA. They were the paymasters behind the whole thing. We have the same situation with Gordon Warson, Robert Gordon Warson, who is credited as the guy who popularized psilocybin mushrooms, magic mushrooms, in the 1950s. Got a lot of press at the time, similar to Leary. He was advocating the use of these compounds to expand consciousness and all of this. Well, unfortunately, it turns out that his famous trip to Mexico to cultivate some of these mushrooms and to associate with some of these indigenous tribes was paid for by the CIA. There is a pay requisition, which is part of MK Ultra Subproject 58 coming out of the CIA, which is in existence to show that the CIA paid for that trip. And by the way, his day job when he wasn't downing mushrooms was as a propaganda guy for JP Morgan Bank. So he's just another expression of the establishment. Same thing with Ken Kesey and his Merry Pranksters. This was this troupe that used to go around all the hotspots of California in the late 1960s, distributing seemingly endless supplies of LSD everywhere that they went. Well, Ken Kesey, I'm glad you're all sitting down because it might be a bit of a shock, but would you believe he turns out to have been an asset of the CIA? Shocking, I know, but there it is. Same thing with the Grateful Dead. And a lot of people have a problem with this because the Grateful Dead are a group that have a very loyal following. They're actually referred to as Deadheads. I think there's a clue in the endearing kind of term by which their fans are known as to what their controllers really thought of them, in that they were known as Deadheads. But the Grateful Dead, when you go through the personnel of this group, you find connections going back into the Bohemian Club, Bohemian Grove, Skull and Bones, Harvard and Yale, and the CIA. It's all there. Unfortunately, you'll find that the dynamic is no different when you cross the Atlantic back over to Britain, and with all the public heroes that were served up during the 1960s, you would have found connections there going into military intelligence and all these different other expressions of the establishment as well. And so it was no different with the Beatles, which is very bad news for a lot of people given their incredible popularity, and nobody's denying that they were an incredibly talented band that put out some great tunes. But Again, the question becomes, do you reach those levels of success all by yourself without a helping hand from those that can make these kind of things happen? So the Beatles started out as basically a boy band, singing really nice, pleasant love songs. She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand. By the time 1966 had rolled around, their music was starting to change. You had the track Tomorrow Never Knows, which was based around lyrics from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, as translated by Timothy Leary, and everything was starting to go a bit weird and a bit psychedelic. And this continued, of course, through the Sgt. Pepper period towards the latter days of the Beatles. And this was all happening in tandem with the other social changes that were occurring at this time, both in Britain and America. Can that really be a coincidence? Can that really be a product of random chance and just evolution left to its own desires versus something that was made to happen? And here we have one of the promotional pictures for the Beatles' Yellow Submarine, and you can see it's replete with occult symbols when you know what you're looking for. You've got the so-called 666 sign being done here by McCartney, in inverted commas. That's a talk for another day, right? And Lennon's given it the old devil horns and all of this. So this is a little indication for those who are paying attention and know what to look for of who it really is that always controlled the Beatles. It's not as if we don't get the symbols. It's not as if we don't get the signs. It's not as if they don't give us an opportunity to know. This is Stu Sutcliffe, the original bassist with the Beatles before Paul McCartney took over. And he died at the age of 21 from a kind of brain aneurysm, reportedly as a result of a fight that he got into in Hamburg in the Beatles' early days. But here he is in a very early pre-fame photograph. So this is before the Beatles got famous. All right, so Stu Sutcliffe died in 1962. The Beatles didn't really break into the public consciousness until 63. And yet, here he is giving a Freemasonic hand sign, making the pyramid there with his hands. And here's another picture of Stuart Sutcliffe behind these railings, which were arranged to render a 666, which is a very important number that crops up time and time again in the music industry and in different aspects of culture. It's letting us know, again, who's really in control. Here's a picture of Mick Jagger from the Rolling Stones' heyday, striking a very interesting pose, which turns out to be rather similar to the Baphomet, which is this androgynous entity, very much beloved of these occult mystery schools, and particularly Freemasonry, and many of these organizations which operate through the corporate music industry. And one last one from the 1960s. I mentioned all the social changes that were taking place. That era brought in new attitudes towards feminism and the birth control pill. And the person at the helm of all of that, launching Ms. magazine and talking about the emancipation of females and all of this, was Gloria Steinem. Well, unfortunately, it turns out that Gloria Steinem, the so-called mother of feminism, was yet another CIA asset who was sent out on many missions on behalf of the agency. Bringing it far more up to date now. So we're talking about fads, trends and movements. It's not something that's restricted to any one decade, to any one time period. It just continues on. As I said, the faces and the names change, but the mission stays the same. So there was a show on BBC TV in the UK last year called Can You Feel It? How Dance Music Conquered the World. And there was a very telling comment from Moby. Moby is an interesting character to study because he comes from a Freemasonic family himself, and he's descended from Herman Melville, who is the guy that wrote the Moby Dick famous novel. His name is Richard Melville. So in this show, he said, if we were sitting here 25,000 years ago, someone might ask, what do you think is compelling those people to bang on logs and dance around a fire while lights flicker in their eyes? You also just described modern dance culture. So an anthropologist could use those same terms to describe music and dancing and hedonism 20,000 years ago or 5 minutes ago. He's talking about how these primal states of being have been harnessed by the entertainment industry, and they've been tapped into and brought to the surface. We saw it in the 1960s with the whole counterculture thing, the hippie flower power movement, LSD, psychedelic rock, relaxed attitudes to sexuality and society and all of this. And what we have now is the modern electronic dance music scene, which, to my thinking, is nothing but a reboot of exactly the same idea pushed out on a different side of the Atlantic in a different time period, but with so many of the same elements present. So instead of LSD, you've now got MDMA, Molly, ecstasy. Instead of psychedelic rock, you've now got electronic produced dance music. And what this whole scene is being used for long term, in my view, is to normalize ideas of transhumanism and the artificial intelligence reality that we're being ushered very quickly into, the smart grid internet of things. Max Egan was talking about that this morning, David Icke spoke about it yesterday. Look at the titles of many of these big leading dance music events all over the world, and note the similarities between the names. You have Dream State, Trance Nation. These all hint at mind control, mass mind control coming through these scenes. Awakening, not the kind of awakening we talk about, a different kind of one, I would suggest. Then, getting towards the end of the list, electronic family, digital society, digital dreams, tomorrow world, Tomorrowland, future music festival, new horizons. These are all implanting ideas in the subliminal minds of young people, because it's young people that go to these dance music events, it's young people that are always in the crosshairs of the social engineers, and it's getting them used to where society is headed, where everything is digital, everything is electronic, everything is transhuman. Every scene needs its Pied Pipers, it needs its chosen gods, leaders, and of course it's no different in the dance music scene. You have the likes of David Guetta, superstar DJ, and he'll get up there behind a DJ podium and put his hands up in the air like that in a Christ-like messianic pose, and he's got the beard to match, right? And it strikes me as really funny that on Saturday nights all around the world, you'll have congregations of thousands of young people gathered in a club or a dance music festival environment. You'll have the leader of the congregation, the DJ, up there at the DJ booth, which is like a religious altar, and he can control the moods and the emotions and the behaviors of that entire crowd with just one action. He can put his hands in the air like that, and 20,000 people would do exactly the same thing. He can start clapping his hands, 20,000 people will clap along at his prompting. Then a few hours later, on Sunday mornings, all around the world, you have a different kind of gathering, you have a different kind of congregation in all these churches, and you have a different kind of leader. But instead of being at a DJ booth, he's at an altar, but he's still controlling the flock. And with one word or one action, he can coerce 20,000 people into a particular behavior. So that's what we have going on with the current electronic dance music scene. And there's no way in heaven, hell, or anywhere else that this would have happened randomly or been allowed to evolve under its own steam. It's been made to happen this way because that's the way they wanted it. Paul van Dyk, another leader of this scene, German DJ and producer, and he's nicknamed here Trance Master. What's in a name, right? Extracurricular activities. So we have these public figures and they're thought of as one thing or another. So we think of them primarily as a politician or maybe a musician or maybe an actor or a TV presenter. But when you get into some of the stuff they do in their spare time, it tells a rather different story. So Bill Gates is supposed to be this nerdy computer geek, right, who invented Microsoft, and that's really all there is to it. But it's not, because when you look into who his dad was, William Gates Sr., he was a prominent member of Planned Parenthood, which is a eugenics operation which is obsessed with population reduction, removing undesirable aspects of society. Here's a quote from the founder of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger, which gives you an insight into their mindset. She said, "The most merciful thing that a large family does to one of its infant members is to kill it." Wow. She openly advocated eugenics. That awkward moment when you realise the nerdy computer guy is actually trying to kill you. Bono, well, he's just a rock star, right? He's just a rock singer with U2 and he goes all around the world playing gigs. Well, if that's the case, what's he doing hanging out with this rogues gallery? You know, can anyone get close to these types of individuals? Not that you'd want to, you know. But here he is hobnobbing with all his mates, which suggests that he's rather more than just a rock star. Because he's familiar in the public psyche, he can be used to prop up certain agendas and to be a figurehead for certain movements as and when he's required. And this is the thing. These people have owners who call the shots and tell them what they're going to be doing next. You can have all the fame and the fortune, and you can have the mansions and the yachts and riches beyond your wildest dreams, but your heart and your soul and your mind are no longer your own, because by the time you reach that stage, you're doing what you're told to do. And so we have a current social engineering agenda going on, which is very alarming to me because I choose to be a vegan. It's a personal choice that I've made for myself. I haven't been influenced or swayed in any way by what any celebrity has said on the subject. Couldn't give a shit what celebrities say. It doesn't affect me at all. But we have Beyonce and Jay-Z, who are highly influential, and young people do tend to hang on their every word, and they're now coming out and advocating veganism, plant-based diets. So I'm asking myself what the real story could be here, because the control system that these two represent are not generally known for their upliftment of all, sentient life in creation. So there's got to be other things going on. Otherwise, these two quite simply would not be making these kind of statements. So in closing, this is an excerpt from my current book, and it just sums everything up. When you learn about how lifetime actors and culture creation work, the question becomes, are you happy you were duped and taken into confidence by these people? And would you like more of it? Or are you rather hacked off that you were treated as such easy fodder, rife for manipulation, and now that you understand how the game is played, do you resolve to never be fooled in the same way again? There's no shame in admitting you were bamboozled. All of us are from the earliest age. The dignity comes from acknowledging that it happened and knowing better for next time. And this is also summed up in the lyrics to the group The Who. I wouldn't recommend following The Who too closely because there's some unsavory connections in their personnel as well, but nevertheless, the lyric really speaks. And they said, there's nothing new in the streets looks any different to me, and the slogans are replaced by the by. And the parting on the left is now the parting on the right, and the beards have all grown longer overnight. In their song Won't Get Fooled Again, they're talking about how societal attitudes are shaped and molded for us if we're not paying attention. So the thing that I would most want people to take away from this talk can be summed up in 3 words, which is no more heroes, except one. There's one person that you can always rely on. There's one person whose background you know all about. There's one person whereby you don't have to worry about any unsavory affiliations coming to the surface, and that's yourself, right? So we don't know any of these public figures really. We just get the public relations version of them, but we know ourselves. And we know we can rely on ourselves and trust ourselves, and we are the only people that we should be giving that kind of power to. We have to be our own heroes. That to me strikes me as pretty good advice. A lot of what I've spoken about today is contained in my 2 books, Musical Truth Volumes 1 and 2. I've got some copies of those here, and I'm going to be in the Stateless store straight after this. I've got a table there. The Stateless store is the last building towards the main hotel as you head back that way. And after that, I'm going to be in the Vegan Verde restaurant, just kind of hanging out there for a bit. So if anyone wants to get a book from me, you can come and catch me there. I'm going to be doing a DJ set tonight, a pool party. It's going to be uplifting music that's going to kick your ass and make you want to jump up, hopefully. That's the intention. That's at the 3rd pool that way, the last pool, kicking off at 8 o'clock tonight. And I'm going to be doing the closing pool party on Sunday evening from around about 6:30 as well, if anyone wants to come and join me for that. Other than that, I want to thank you for your attention, and thanks for coming out today. No more heroes.
Anarchapulco, it's so hype, I'm trying to tell ya. This the event of the year and best vacation ever. Ron Carter, Jeffrey Tucker, just to name a few. Get your tickets, you don't want to miss it. You should roll through. Talking politics to health and self-improvement to investing. So many things, not one thing. Learn how to live life unchained, yeah. 4 days vibing on the beach, time to connect. All about growth, way more than a conference. This is Anarchapulco, yeah. Let's go.
You ain't seen nothing yet.